Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your having the hearing today. And Mr. Reddick, you and I have had a chance to visit on a number of issues, including, as the chairman indicated, our appreciation that you're willing to step up and serve. I also want to, if I could, mention Army Captain Charlie Reddick again, who just came back, you said, from a 12-month deployment in a combat zone. I'm going to embarrass him and ask him to stand up, if he would, just for a second, because I'd like to give him a round of applause. He's right. You're following him in service, and although it's not combat, it's going to be a tough job. And
I think it is combat.
yeah. So you and I talked a lot about IRS reform, and one reason I'm excited about having a commissioner in place, I think it's an opportunity for this committee, working with you and the Ways and Means Committee, to make some changes at the IRS again. We did this 20 years ago with a big Restructuring and Reform Act. It came after a commission was formed, actually by this body. I co-chaired that with Senator Bob Kerrey, as you know, and then along with Senator Ben Cardin, who is coming in a moment, will be here. We introduced legislation that Senator Hatch took a leadership role on, as did Senator Wyden in his role then on the committee. And what we did was we said, okay, the IRS is not working, it's not functioning to help taxpayers. At that time, you know, only half of the calls were being answered when a taxpayer would call the IRS, and they'd spent about $3 billion on a IT system that wasn't working, wasn't talking to each other. It was a big waste, and so we undertook this series of reforms. 52 different new taxpayer rights were added, and so on. IRS Oversight Board. So half the calls were being returned back in that period. We passed the legislation within 10 years. Instead of half the calls being returned, 83% of the calls were being answered. So that was a big improvement. And in all the ratings you looked at, you know, which agency or department do you feel is doing a good job for the taxpayer? IRS was at the bottom when we started the reforms. By the time 10 years were up and the reforms were getting in place, it was about halfway up the ladder, which isn't bad for the tax collection agency. I will say, you know, here we are 10 years later, and unfortunately we're kind of back to a situation where taxpayers are not being served. By 2015, just 3 years ago, only 37% of calls were being answered. Today, I understand it's back closer to 50%, but way unacceptable. First of all, do you agree with me on that?
I agree that America's taxpayers should have their telephones answered if they call the Internal Revenue Service. I think that's critical not only for whatever the reason they're calling. I think it's critical for them to earn the respect of the agency they're interacting with when they get efficient and timely responses.
That's not the only measurement. Another measurement would be how many taxpayers can come in and, you know, actually get an answer from a person, and that's also declined. Another issue I know that Senator Cardin and I are looking at is the appeals process. We believe it's been more truncated since 20 years ago when we put the reforms in place. We need to get back to a system where people feel like they have an absolute right to appeal. There's other issues as well, but one that you and I talked a lot about in our meeting was the IRS Oversight Board. This is something that Senator Kerrey felt very strongly about, as did I and others, and we put in place this IRS Oversight Board that would bring expertise, you know, service sector expertise, management expertise, and frankly, I think it started off pretty well, and then because of lack of support by every administration, frankly, along the way, it kind of fell to the wayside. And the idea was not to have a commission every 20 years and not to have a process that I think we need to undergo again this next couple of years, hopefully with a new commissioner in place, hopefully with you, but to have this commission perform that role of oversight and ensuring that we stayed on track. There are literally no members of the commission right now. Not a single member has been appointed. And again, this goes back administrations. The Obama administration was no more supportive really than the Clinton administration was, than the Bush administration, than the current administration. So what do you think about the IRS Oversight Board? Was it a good idea or a bad idea? Do you think it should be resurrected? And do you think it has a role to play?
I'm in favor of oversight by the IRS Oversight Board, by this committee, by others. I think that it assists in the transparency of the operations of the Internal Revenue Service, as well as providing assistance. As commissioner, I would look forward to getting ideas from everybody, and more ideas the better, and then we'll work on the ideas collectively.
Well, I appreciate that answer, and I do think that if you're confirmed, that this committee is going to be very interested in working with you on IRS reform, and I hope that will be part of the discussion. Just last question, just briefly, on the idea of having an independent appeals process, do you support taxpayers having access to an independent appeals process?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.